Through democracy, philosophy, mathematics, science, and the arts, the ideas of the ancient Greeks have contributed greatly to modern society. Greek philosophers and thinkers from Aristotle to Diogenes provide some of the most colorful and charming perspectives on the condition of humanity. Considering all of the ways that the Greeks have commanded our respect, their beliefs about human happiness deserve our consideration. This video will examine 3 stories spread across 400 years of Greek history. The first story comes from Herodotus, and it is one of the few Greek stories which appear to be written about happiness. Around 440 BC, Herodotus recorded the story of Solon and Croesus. Solon was an Athenian statesman, and it is said he went to the kingdom of Lydia to speak with Croesus, who was the king there. Croesus showed Solon the wealth of his kingdom and asked him, "Whom of all the men that you have seen do you deem the most happy?" Croesus thought himself the happiest man, but Solon said to him, "Why, tell us of Athens." Because his country was flourishing in his days, and he himself had sons both beautiful and good, and he lived to see children born to each of them, and these children all grew up. And further, because after a life spent in what our people look upon as comfort, his end was surpassingly glorious. In a battle, he came to the assistance of his countrymen, routed the foe, and died upon the field most gallantly. Croesus asked Solon who was second most happy, expecting at any rate he would be given the second place. But Solon said, "Clovis and Biton, twins of great bodily strength. When their ailing mother asked them to bring her to a festival in honor of the goddess Hera, the 2 men put the yokes of her cart upon their own necks and ran 5 miles to the temple. When they stopped, they fell asleep in the temple, and there they died." Croesus was dissatisfied with Solon's answer, but Solon defended himself by saying, "Croesus, I see that you are wonderfully rich and are king over many men, but with respect to that whereon you question me, I have no answer to give until I hear that you have closed your life happily." Solon then suggests that because fate and fortune are unpredictable, it is impossible to know for certain whether someone has had a happy life until their life is over. By Herodotus' accounting, it seems that in the end, Croesus had an unhappy life. One of his sons was born deaf, and the other was killed in a hunting accident. Shortly thereafter, his kingdom was conquered by the Persians, and he was enslaved. Because the story of Croesus unfolds as a sort of parable, it appears to indicate that Solon's stance was the definitive Greek stance on the matter. But both sides of the argument tell us something about how the Greeks thought about happiness. While Solon cautions against coming to a judgment about happiness, Croesus reveals a habit among the Greeks of formulating assumptions about happiness. A more generous reading of the Solon and Croesus story suggests that Croesus considered his current wealth to be a sign of his good fortune, while Solon reminds Croesus of the unreliability of such signs. Both stances appear in the Homeric epics also. The Iliad was written around 800 BC, 400 years before the story of Solon and Croesus. The Odyssey was written around 650 BC. I say written, but the Iliad and Odyssey were passed down orally for many years before they were transcribed. This means that the stories are actually older, and that they likely underwent many transformations before their present form. Yet each story tackles happiness in its own way, and by looking at these 2 stories and comparing them with Solon and Croesus' meeting, we can establish 3 rough snapshots of the Greek perspective on happiness across time. There are some limitations to this project, because the history of how the stories developed is limited, and because my own knowledge of Greek being limited, I'm forced to trust the translator's use of the words happy and unhappy. But I am trusting Samuel Butler's translation, and although this means from the outset that this will be an imperfect exercise, it may still prove informative. The Iliad tells the tale of the Trojan War, but begins 9 years into the war. The story of the Trojan horse is often confused with the Iliad, but the Iliad actually ends before the fall of the city of Troy. Instead, it details the numerous battles outside of the walls, political intrigue, and personal conflict in the camp of the Argives and among the Trojans. The text opens with the hero Achilles refusing to fight for the Argives because Agamemnon stole his slave from him. The Argives suffer terribly without Achilles, but when Hector, the son of the Trojan king, kills Achilles' dear friend in battle, Achilles re-enters the fight. With the help of Achilles, the Argives push the Trojans back into their city, and Achilles kills Hector. In a fit of rage, he lashes him to a chariot and drags his body back to the Argive camp. Priam, the king of Troy, goes alone into the Argive camp in the night and tries to ransom the body of his son from Achilles. Achilles gives a peculiar speech to Priam when he agrees to give his son's body back to him. Unhappy man, on the floor of Zeus's palace there stand two urns, the one filled with evil gifts, and the other one filled with good ones. I've heard that you were aforetime happy. They say that in wealth and plenitude of offspring you surpassed all. But from the day when the dwellers in heaven sent this evil upon you, war and slaughter have been about your city continually. Achilles notes on the one hand that Priam was aforetime happy, but he also notes that it was taken from him by the dwellers in heaven. The description of the two urns reinforces the notion that the course of human lives is determined by fate. This is a sentiment very much in line with the argument which Solon would make 400 years later. Yet in the very same speech, Achilles himself judges Priam's happiness by his current circumstances by referring to him as unhappy when he first addresses him. Very similar judgments are made throughout the Iliad. Priam himself says as much earlier in the text, before Hector goes out to fight Achilles. From atop the walls of Troy, he implores his son, saying, "Have pity also on your unhappy father, whom Zeus will destroy by a terrible doom in the threshold of old age. After I have seen my sons slain and my daughters hauled away as captives, my bridal chambers pillaged, little children dashed to the earth amid the rage of battle, and my sons' wives dragged away by the cruel hands of the Achaeans." Similarly, Hector's wife, Andromache, declares upon learning of Hector's death that the child of whom you and I are now the unhappy parents is as yet a mere infant. Even though he escaped the horrors of this woeful war with the Achaeans, yet shall his life henceforth be one of labor and sorrow. Here Andromache predicts firstly that her child will be enslaved, and that this makes the now deceased Hector and herself unhappy parents. This implies on the one hand that Hector is unhappy in the same sense that Solon called Tellus, Clovis, and Biton happy, but she also suggests that her own happiness can be written off entirely because of the fate she presumes for her child. All of these examples have been among the Trojans, but another instance appears among the Achaeans in a scene closer to the beginning of the text. At one point, the Trojans drive the Achaeans into the fort which they built upon the beach. The Danaan prince, Patroclus, sees the bad state that the Achaeans are in and remarks, "O unhappy princes and counselors of the Danaans, are you then doomed to feed the hounds of Troy with your fat, far from your friends in your native land?" In this instance, Patroclus associates defeat with unhappiness, but he's also connecting the current state of his comrades to future unhappiness. It should be noted that most of these claims have so far been about unhappiness as opposed to happiness. In fact, the root of the word happiness appears only 3 times in the entire text. Once in the conversation between Achilles and Priam, which we have already seen, and in 2 other cases. When the Argives first reach the walls of Troy, Priam sees the king of the Argives, Agamemnon, and asks Helen who he is. "Tell me, who is yonder huge hero so great and godly? I've seen men taller by a head, but none so comely and so royal. Surely he must be a king." Helen replies, "Agamemnon, son of Atreus, a good king and a brave soldier." And Priam responds, "Happy son of Atreus, child of good fortune." This instance implies a few things about happiness. Chiefly that it can be caused by beauty, by the phrase, so comely and so royal, but it also suggests that being a good king and a brave soldier are somehow related to happiness. It is also possible in this case that Priam is simply observing that Agamemnon is happy. At this point in the story, the Argives had just won a significant, if temporary, victory. In the other case, Achilles finds Lycon, another son of Priam, upon the battlefield. Lycon was ransomed by Achilles before the Iliad begins, but he spent 11 days happily with his friends, before returning to the battlefield and being killed by Achilles. Lycon himself appears only briefly in the story, and it is a sort of fleeting comment, but it indicates, at the very least, that being with one's friends is something which one can do happily, a sentiment which might be reduced as camaraderie. In any case, while there is the same consideration of fate which Solon would make 400 years later, the Iliad is filled with instances where characters formulate predictions about their emotions in the same manner which Croesus did. Achilles himself, though he offers that kernel of wisdom about fate's role in determining human happiness, assumes that Priam is fated to unhappiness, and also asserts that wealth and having a large family are related to happiness. Priam himself believes that losing the war and the subsequent destruction of his family will make him unhappy. Hector's wife Andromache believes that the future enslavement of her son will make her unhappy. Patroclus, much like Priam, believes that losing to the Trojans would be a source of unhappiness. Priam, when he observes Agamemnon, implies that beauty, bravery, and good rulership are each related to happiness. In the moment before Achilles kills Lycon, the claim is made that camaraderie is related to happiness. It isn't necessarily the case that their predictions are correct. Solon's wisdom still applies. Fate could bring them greater happiness in the end or greater unhappiness. Consider that Agamemnon, whom Priam called happy when he stood below the gates of Troy, came to an unhappy end. He was murdered by his wife and her lover when he returned home from the war. This doesn't discount the trend among the ancient Greeks, and possibly among humans generally, to formulate theories about the future state of their emotions based on the evidence at hand. A similar relationship appears in the Odyssey, though both happiness and unhappiness are used much more frequently in the Odyssey and in a greater variety of ways. The Odyssey also takes a very different tone from the Iliad. While the Iliad is exclusively a war story, the Odyssey follows Odysseus, a hero from the Iliad who gets lost at sea while returning from the Trojan War. He leaves his wife Penelope and son Telemachus to manage his estate, but while away from home, many suitors attempt to woo his wife and use up Odysseus' estate by abusing Penelope's and Telemachus' hospitality. In two instances, happiness is directly connected to fate. When Telemachus goes to Pylos to ask about his father's fate, Menelaus, hero of the Trojan War and friend to Odysseus, wishes that he had given Odysseus one of his own cities, so that they could have gone together in their ships to Troy, and thereby returned together. Dwelling on this possibility, he says, "We should thus have seen one another continually, and nothing but death could have interrupted so close and happy an intercourse. I suppose, however, that heaven grudged us such a great good fortune, for it has prevented the poor fellow from getting home at all." Menelaus imagines that the camaraderie which could have been had between himself and Odysseus would have caused happiness, but he also concedes that such happiness was grudged by heaven. Later on in the text, Penelope, Odysseus' wife, says to Odysseus, after they have been reunited, that if the gods are going to vouchsafe you a happier time in your old age, you may hope then to have some respite from misfortune, clearly connecting happiness to the gods, and presumably also to fate. Fate is a particularly important theme in the Odyssey, as Odysseus is literally cast about the Mediterranean by various deities until finally making his way home. And while the general course of the story seems in line with Solon's warnings about the course of fate, in many other ways, the Odyssey alludes to Croesus' habit of assuming happiness based on the evidence at hand. There are at least 10 instances in the Odyssey where individuals refer to Odysseus as unhappy. They use phrases like, "his unhappy father," "my unhappy husband," "poor unhappy stranger." In most cases, characters assume that because Odysseus failed to return home, he became lost at sea and either drowned or is still lost. Yet, they have no real evidence of his death or the circumstances of his death, but they assume that Odysseus is unhappy because of the fate they presumed for him. In other cases, individuals call Odysseus unhappy as though they are observing it about him. In two peculiar instances, deities make such a claim. In the very beginning of the Odyssey, Athena, the goddess of wisdom no less, says to Zeus, "Poor unhappy Odysseus." And later on, Hermes, the messenger of the gods, says to Odysseus, "My poor unhappy man." The fact that, within the Odyssey at least, Odysseus actually does come to what Solon might call a happy end, implies that even the gods, who are actively involved in the course of fate, did not actually know its course. At another point in the story, when Athena and Telemachus go to Pylos to seek information about Odysseus, Athena actually prays to Poseidon, asking that he grant Telemachus and herself a happy issue. That is, that Poseidon grant them success in finding Odysseus. This implies, on the one hand, that Athena believed that succeeding in this way, finding Odysseus, would lead to happiness, but also that even though Athena is ostensibly on the side of Odysseus, she cannot guarantee the course of fate. This suggests that when Athena calls Odysseus unhappy, she really is making a prediction rather than benefiting from any foreknowledge. Many other cases appear throughout the story where characters make similar such judgments about happiness. Early in the story, Odysseus encounters the princess Nausicaa, and stunned by her beauty, he says to her, I can only conjecture that you are Zeus's daughter Artemis, for your face can resemble none but hers. If, on the other hand, you are mortal and live on earth, thrice happy are your father and mother. Thrice happy, too, are your brothers and sisters. How proud and delighted they must feel when they see so fair a scion as yourself going out to dance. Most happy, however, of all will be he whose wedding gifts have been richest and who takes you to his home. Here Odysseus implies that beauty is a source of happiness, if not for Nausicaa herself, then for those around her. This is a similar claim to that which Priam made about Agamemnon from atop the walls of Troy, that beauty is a sign of good fortune and of happiness. When Odysseus finally returns home and defeats the suitors who were harassing his wife, a servant says to Penelope that Odysseus has sent me to call you, so come with me that you may both be happy together after all. This implies that their being reunited is a source of happiness, and that being reunited is a sign of future happiness. Penelope complains to Odysseus shortly thereafter that heaven has denied us the happiness of spending our youth and growing old together. This reinforces on the one hand the role which fate has in the determination of happiness, but also suggests an awareness of happier possible outcomes, and a belief that better happiness might have been had if they had gotten to spend their youths together and gotten to grow old together. Odysseus says something similar earlier in the text when he uses happiness as a blessing. When he's leaving the kingdom of Scheria, he says to Queen Arete, who granted him safe passage, I now take my leave. Be happy in this house with your children, your people, and with King Alcinous. Here Odysseus connects three things to happiness: being with one's children, with one's people, and with one's spouse. Odysseus also highlights that the ancient Greeks may have viewed happiness as something which could be wished upon another person. In a final example, and this comes near the very end of the Odyssey, Agamemnon, the heroic king from the Iliad, who resides in Hades, speaks of Odysseus, remarking that, Happy Odysseus, son of Laertes, you are indeed blessed in the possession of a wife endowed with such rare excellence of understanding, and so faithful to her wedded lord as Penelope, the daughter of Icarius. It should be recalled that Agamemnon was himself murdered by his wife upon returning from the Trojan War. But in this sentence, he suggests that a spouse with excellence of understanding, what we might call wisdom, and a faithful spouse are both causes of happiness. Fate remains a constant theme throughout the Odyssey, and in many ways it is a tale about the unpredictability of fate, but it is nevertheless filled with cases where individuals formulate claims about emotions based on whatever evidence they have at hand. Yet there's an interesting trend in that happiness and unhappiness appear much more frequently in the Odyssey and in a greater variety of ways. Despite this, many of the claims are repetitions of claims which we saw in the Iliad. Menelaus and Penelope both comment on the role which fate has to play in determining happiness. Menelaus also notes the value of camaraderie when he wishes that Odysseus might have returned with him. By the constant use of unhappy to describe Odysseus, several different characters suggest that dying lost at sea or being lost at sea are not conducive to happiness. When Athena prays to Poseidon, she suggests that successfully finding information about Odysseus would lead to happiness. This might be reduced simply to success. Odysseus argues upon meeting Nausicaa that beauty is a source of happiness. It is implied by multiple characters when Odysseus and Penelope are reunited that being reunited is a source of happiness. Also that spending youth together and growing old together are sources of happiness. Odysseus' farewell to Queen Arete suggests that happiness could be used as a blessing, but also that happiness might consist simply of being with one's children, people, or spouse. Agamemnon's comment in Hades suggests that having an intelligent and faithful spouse is conducive to happiness. These claims can be sorted into ones about happiness and about unhappiness. They can be further arranged so that we can compare the claims more easily. In both stories, fate, camaraderie, and beauty are related to happiness. Both stories also emphasize the importance of family. This is an especially important theme in the Odyssey, but it can also be seen in the negative sense within the Iliad, as the destruction of Priam's family causes great unhappiness. Each text also implies that success and defeat are potential routes to happiness or to unhappiness. The Iliad uniquely suggests that bravery, good rulership, and wealth are related to happiness. Bravery and good rulership seem particularly relevant to the Iliad, firstly because it is a war story, and secondly because it is by needlessly enraging Achilles at the beginning of the text that Agamemnon causes such undue suffering for the Achaeans. This might be called bad rulership. The Odyssey uniquely claims that regarding one's spouse, spending youth together and growing old together are sources of happiness. This claim seems related to family, but it also implies a special appreciation for marital life. This also seems to be an important theme throughout the Odyssey, as it is the reward for Odysseus' heroic journey. The Odyssey also implies that happiness can be used as a blessing, which is strangely in line with the wisdom which Solon offers to Croesus. A blessing implies at once that Odysseus hopes for a specific outcome, but it is different from a prediction because it implies an awareness of potential future difficulties. The Odyssey also implies that being reunited is a source of happiness, but also that being lost at sea or dying at sea are sources of unhappiness. These two unhappiness claims are really the inverse of being reunited. Based on these two stories, family appears to be the most central theme around which Greek notions of happiness revolved. The peak of anguish in the Iliad comes from the destruction of Priam's family, and the peak of joy in the Odyssey comes from the reunification of Odysseus with his family. While fate also seems to be a central concern, it doesn't seem central to the Greek conception of happiness so much as it is a condition of life. To the extent that the ancient Greeks conceived of happiness and unhappiness, it was in relation to those things which really do cause effective happiness or unhappiness, not in relation to the course of their entire lives. Even if they conceived of happiness in terms of good fortune, they used the signs at hand to determine whether fortune was truly on their side. Of course, such predictions are prone to error, and it seems that this is the true kernel of wisdom found in the story of Solon and Croesus. While Solon insisted that a person must live their entire life before he could declare them happy or unhappy, this was probably not the common custom. Instead, the ancient Greeks constantly evaluated their emotions based on the circumstances and used those circumstances to formulate predictions about the course of events and about their future emotions. Those who benefited from Solon's wisdom might have been able to navigate those circumstances more successfully, but Solon's wisdom was not the definitive stance on happiness in ancient Greece. Still, it might benefit modern persons to consider part of Solon's advice for themselves. In every matter it behooves us to mark well the end, for oft times the god gives men a gleam of happiness, and then plunges them into ruin.